The dust kicked up around Louisa Nash's boots as she hauled another feed sack toward the barn, her arms screaming in protest while sweat dripped down her temples in the unforgiving Texas heat of June 1884. She had been up since before dawn, tending to her father's ranch outside Fort Worth, and the day showed no signs of getting easier as three of her younger siblings came running toward her with yet another crisis involving the chickens getting loose again. "Louisa! Louisa!" Her youngest sister Mary called out, her pigtails flying behind her as she ran. "The rooster got into Mama's garden again and he's eating all the tomatoes." Louisa set down the heavy sack with a grunt, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. At 23 years old, she had been running this ranch practically single-handedly since her father Robert Nash had taken ill 2 years ago. Her mother had passed when Mary was born, leaving Louisa to raise her 4 younger siblings while also managing the cattle, the crops, the repairs, and everything else that came with keeping a struggling ranch afloat in North Texas. Her brothers Thomas and William were only 14 and 12, too young to handle the heavy work, and Mary at 8 needed constant supervision. "I'll get him," Louisa said, already turning toward the garden even though she had a dozen other tasks waiting. Her back ached from mucking out the stables that morning, her hands were raw from mending fence posts the day before, and she could not remember the last time she had sat down for more than 5 minutes. The rooster proved difficult to catch, leading her on a merry chase through the trampled tomato plants, while Mary giggled despite the destruction. By the time Louisa cornered the bird and returned him to the coop with a stronger latch, the morning was half gone, and she still needed to ride out to check on the cattle in the south pasture, fix the leak in the barn roof, help Thomas with his reading lessons since there was no school nearby, and prepare supper for everyone. "You look about ready to drop," her father said from his chair on the porch when she passed by. Robert Nash had once been a strong man, but illness had withered him, leaving him able to offer advice but little physical help. "You are doing too much, daughter." "Someone has to do it," Louisa replied, trying to keep the exhaustion from her voice. Her father already felt guilty enough about his condition without her adding to it. "You should be thinking about your own life, finding a husband, having your own family. Not spending your best years caring for all of us." Louisa paused at the porch steps, looking at her father with affection despite her weariness. "This is my family, Papa. I will worry about the rest later." But later seemed like a distant dream, something for women who had time to pretty themselves up and attend church socials. Louisa's hands were too calloused for delicate needlework, her skin too sun-darkened from working outdoors, her dresses too worn and practical for courting. The few young men in the area had long since stopped looking her way, deterred by her sharp tongue when she was tired and the overwhelming responsibilities that came with the Nash family. She rode out to check the cattle on their old mare, Bess, scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble. The ranch was not large by Texas standards, but it was all they had, and losing it would mean destitution for her entire family. She counted heads, checked the fences, and made mental notes of 3 more fence posts that needed replacing before the week was out. On her way back, she spotted a rider approaching from the east, leading a packhorse behind him. Louisa tensed, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle in her saddle holster. Strangers could mean trouble, though this man seemed to be traveling alone and without obvious hostile intent. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a dark hat pulled low against the sun, with broad shoulders and an easy way of sitting his horse that spoke of long hours riding. His horse was a fine bay gelding, well kept, and his gear looked quality but used. "Afternoon," he called out when he was within speaking distance, touching the brim of his hat politely. "Name's Grant Russell. I'm looking for the Nash Ranch." Louisa studied him carefully. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of stubble and dark eyes that held her gaze steadily. There was something honest in his face, though she had learned not to trust first impressions too readily. "You have found it," she said. "What's your business here?" "I heard in town that Robert Nash might be looking for a hired hand. I am looking for work." Louisa almost laughed at the bitter irony. They desperately needed help, it was true, but they had no money to pay anyone. The ranch barely produced enough to feed them and cover the basic necessities. Her father must have mentioned needing help to someone during his last visit to town months ago, before things got even tighter. "I am afraid there has been a misunderstanding," she began, but Grant raised a hand. "If you will pardon me, madam, I can see from here that your barn roof needs patching, and those fence lines are not going to hold come storm season. I passed at least a dozen things on the ride in that need a man's attention." His tone was not condescending, just factual. "I am guessing you are running this place mostly on your own, and I am guessing you do not have cash to spare for wages." Louisa bristled despite the truth of his words. "Then why are you here wasting both our time?" "Because I am not looking for cash wages just yet. I am looking for a place to stay while I get my bearings in this area, and I am willing to work for room and board until you can afford to pay me proper. I am a good hand with cattle. I can fix just about anything that is broken, and I do not eat much." She wanted to refuse on principle. The last thing she needed was a stranger underfoot, another mouth to feed even if he claimed to eat little, another complication in her already impossible life. But as she looked at his capable hands on the reins and thought about that barn roof she had been dreading, about the fence posts and the 100 other tasks she could barely keep up with, something in her wavered. "Why would you work for just room and board?" she asked suspiciously. "What are you running from?" Grant's expression did not change. "Nothing illegal, if that is what you are worried about. I have no family, no ties, and I left a bad situation down in San Antonio. I need a fresh start, and I figure honest work is the way to earn it. You can write to the sheriff there if you want a reference. Sheriff Martinez knows me and will vouch I have never been in trouble with the law." "We do not have much," Louisa said slowly. "The house is small and already crowded with my father and my siblings. You would be sleeping in the barn, and meals are plain. Madam, I have slept under the stars with nothing but my saddle for a pillow more nights than I can count. A barn sounds like luxury, and I have never been particular about food." Louisa sat silent for a moment, weighing the risks against the desperate need. Her body made the decision for her when her shoulder twinged painfully from all the heavy lifting. "1-month trial," she finally said. "You work hard, cause no trouble, and stay respectful, you can stay on. You give me any reason to doubt you and you are gone. Understood?" "Yes, madam. You will not regret this." She hoped he was right as she led him back toward the ranch house. Her father was surprised but pleased when she explained the arrangement, and her siblings gathered around curiously to inspect the newcomer. Grant handled their scrutiny with good humor, answering Mary's endless questions patiently and shaking hands with Thomas and William like they were grown men worth respecting. "The barn needs mucking out before you settle in," Louisa told him, testing to see if he would balk at dirty work right away. "I will get right to it. Just point me to the tools." He was as good as his word. By evening, the barn was cleaner than it had been in months, his horse and pack horse settled comfortably in stalls, and his own bedroll arranged neatly in the loft. When Louisa called him in for supper, he washed up thoroughly at the pump and came to the table with his hat in his hands. The meal was simple, just beans and cornbread with some salt pork, but Grant ate with evident appreciation. He complimented Louisa's cooking sincerely, made her father laugh with a story about a stubborn mule he had once known, and even helped Mary learn her letters after the dishes were cleared. Louisa watched him warily as she scrubbed the plates, looking for signs of falseness or ulterior motives, but Grant seemed genuine. When he excused himself for the night, thanking them for their hospitality, she was left confused by this stranger who had ridden into their lives. "He seems like a good man," her father said quietly after Grant had gone. "Strong worker, respectful. We could use someone like that around here." "We will see," Louisa said, unwilling to trust so quickly. But that night, for the first time in months, she slept a little more soundly knowing there was another capable adult on the property. Grant proved his worth quickly. He was up before dawn the next morning, already feeding the animals by the time Louisa emerged from the house. When she went to start her usual routine, she found half the chores already done. The chickens were fed, the cow milked, the horses tended, and Grant was examining the barn roof with a critical eye. "I can patch this today if you have some spare shingles," he called down when he noticed her. "We do not," Louisa admitted. "I have been meaning to get some, but—" She trailed off, not wanting to admit they lacked the money. "I saw some old boards in the back that might work temporarily. It will not be pretty, but it will keep the rain out until we can do it proper. We." The word stuck with her as she went about her morning tasks. It had been so long since ranch work was we instead of just her against an endless tide of responsibilities. By mid-morning, Grant had the roof patched and was working on the fence posts. Louisa brought him water and watched him work, noting the efficient way he moved, wasting no motion. He had removed his shirt in the heat, and she could see he was all lean muscle and old scars, a man who had worked hard his whole life. "Where did you learn ranch work?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Grant paused in his digging to wipe his forehead. "Grew up on a ranch in New Mexico. My parents died when I was 15 and the bank took the land. I have been hiring out as a cowhand ever since, moving from place to place." "That must be a lonely way to live," he shrugged. "It was all I knew. But lately I have been thinking it might be nice to settle somewhere, put down roots, build something instead of just drifting." There was something wistful in his voice that touched Louisa despite her reservations. She knew about wanting to build something, about fighting to keep what little you had. "Well, you picked a poor ranch to settle at if you are looking for prosperity." Grant smiled, and it transformed his face, making him suddenly handsome in a rugged way. "Prosperity is not everything. Sometimes having people who need you is worth more than gold." The comment left Louisa flustered, unused to such sentiment from near strangers. She retreated to the house, busying herself with preparations for the noon meal, but his words echoed in her mind. "People who need you." She had people who needed her in abundance, so many that it was drowning her, but no one she could need in return. It had been that way for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to share a burden. Over the following days, Grant integrated himself into the ranch's rhythm. He fixed the things that had been broken for months, tended the cattle with expert skill, and even helped Thomas and William learn to rope properly, something Louisa had never had time to teach them. The boys followed him around like eager puppies, soaking up his attention and instruction. Louisa found her workload easing for the first time in years. Tasks that had taken her all day were finished by noon with Grant's help, leaving her with unfamiliar stretches of time. She used them to mend clothes that had been sitting in a basket for months, to actually cook proper meals instead of throwing together whatever was quickest, to sit with her father and read to him from the newspaper. "You look different," her father observed one evening. "Less tired." I suppose I am, Louisa admitted. Grant has been a great help. He is a good man. You could do worse. Papa, Louisa felt her cheeks flush. He is an employee, nothing more. An employee who works for no wages and looks at you like you hung the moon, her father said with a knowing smile. I may be old and sick, but I am not blind. Louisa dismissed the comment, but it planted a seed of awareness. She started noticing the way Grant's eyes followed her when she moved around the yard, not in a disrespectful way, but with a kind of quiet admiration. She noticed how he always saved the easier tasks for her, taking the hardest work on himself without complaint. She noticed the gentle way he spoke to her siblings, the respect he showed her father, the small kindnesses he performed without expecting recognition. She also noticed, against her will, the way his hands looked holding a rope, the sound of his laugh when William told a joke, the rare smile that softened his weathered features. She noticed and tried not to notice, afraid of what it might mean. 3 weeks into Grant's stay, a summer storm rolled across the prairie with fury. The sky turned green-black, and the wind howled like a living thing. Louisa rushed to get the animals secured while Grant helped her father and siblings into the root cellar. The rain came in sheets, turning the ground to mud in minutes. They huddled in the cellar, listening to the storm rage overhead. Mary clung to Louisa, frightened by the thunder, while Thomas and William tried to act brave. Grant lit a lantern, casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. The cattle, Louisa said suddenly, her stomach dropping. They were in the south pasture. If the creek floods, they will be trapped. You cannot go out in this, her father said firmly, but Louisa was already moving toward the door. Those cattle were everything. Without them, the ranch would fail completely. Grant caught her arm gently. If you are going, I am coming with you, he said. It was not a question. They rode out together into the storm, the rain so heavy they could barely see 10 feet ahead. The wind threatened to knock them from their saddles, and lightning split the sky in jagged bolts. Louisa led them toward the south pasture, her heart pounding with fear for the animals and sudden awareness that she had allowed Grant to risk his life for her cattle. They found the herd milling nervously near the creek, which was already rising fast, the water churning brown with mud and debris. Working together with shouted communication barely audible over the storm, they managed to drive the cattle toward higher ground. It was exhausting, dangerous work. Louisa's horse stumbled in the mud, nearly throwing her, but Grant was there instantly, steadying her mount with his own. By the time they got the herd to safety, both of them were soaked to the bone and shaking with cold despite the warm night. The storm was beginning to ease as they rode back to the ranch, the worst of it passing over. You did not have to risk yourself for our cattle, Louisa said as they unsaddled the horses in the barn. Yes, I did, Grant replied simply. This is my home now too for as long as you will have me. Your problems are my problems. Something in Louisa's chest cracked open at those words. She looked at this man who had come to them as a stranger and who was becoming something she dared not name. Her defenses, built so carefully over years of shouldering everything alone, began to crumble. Grant, she started, not sure what she wanted to say. He stepped closer, and in the dim light of the barn, with rain still dripping from his hair, he looked at her with such open warmth that it took her breath away. You do not have to carry everything by yourself, Louisa. I know you are used to it. I know you think you have to be strong for everyone, but you do not have to be strong alone anymore. Let me help, not just with the ranch work, but with all of it. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Why do you care so much? Grant reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her cheek. Because somewhere between fixing that barn roof and chasing your sister's rooster, I started caring about this place, about this family, about you. Louisa's breath caught. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as something other than a workhorse, to be looked at with tenderness instead of need. I am not. I am not like other women. I am rough around the edges. I am too independent, too outspoken. I come with a whole family of responsibilities that would overwhelm any man. I know exactly who you are, Grant said softly. You are the strongest person I have ever met, and those responsibilities you are talking about, they are not a burden to me. They are part of you, and I want to share them if you will let me. Tears surprised Louisa, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She had held so much inside for so long, had been so determinedly self-sufficient, that the offer of genuine partnership undid her. Grant pulled her into his arms and she let herself be held, let herself be weak just for a moment in the safety of his embrace. I am scared, she admitted against his shoulder. Of what? Of trusting this. Of trusting you. Of what happens if I let myself need you and you leave. Grant pulled back enough to look into her eyes. I am not going anywhere, Louisa. I have been drifting my whole life looking for somewhere to belong. I found it here with you. If you will have me, I am staying. She kissed him then, throwing caution aside, and he responded with a gentle passion that made her feel precious and desired and cherished. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Louisa was smiling through her tears. The whole town is going to talk, she said. About you staying here, about us. Let them talk. We will be married soon enough if you will say yes to me properly courting you. Courting, Louisa laughed. We have been living on the same property for 3 weeks. I think we are a bit past traditional courting. Then let me do this right. Grant stepped back and took her hand formally. Louisa Nash, would you allow me the honor of courting you with the intention of making you my wife? I know I have nothing to offer but my labor and my heart, but both are yours completely. Yes, Louisa said, the word easy and right. Yes, Grant Russell, I will let you court me. They walked back to the house hand in hand, the storm having passed and left the world clean and fresh. Her family had emerged from the cellar and cheered when they saw Louisa and Grant together, her father beaming with satisfaction and her siblings dancing with excitement. The next weeks were a revelation to Louisa. Grant courted her with a determination and sweetness that made her feel like a girl instead of a weary woman. He picked wildflowers for her on his way back from checking the herd, leaving them on the porch rail where she would find them. He insisted she take time for herself, handling her evening chores so she could wash her hair and mend her best dress. He sat with her on the porch after supper, talking about their hopes and dreams, sharing stories from their pasts, learning each other deeply. But it was not just romance. True to his word, Grant shared every responsibility. When her father had a bad spell, Grant sat up with him through the night so Louisa could sleep. When Mary had nightmares, Grant told her stories about brave cowgirls until she giggled. When the cattle needed branding, Grant worked beside Louisa as an equal partner, respecting her knowledge and skill. The town did indeed talk when Louisa rode into Fort Worth with Grant by her side, but she found she did not care. Let them whisper about the Nash girl who had snagged herself a handsome cowboy. She knew the truth, that she had found a partner in every sense of the word. Grant proved himself in the eyes of the community too. When old Mr. Peterson's barn caught fire, Grant was the first there to help put it out and the last to leave, making sure all the animals were safe. When the church needed repairs, he volunteered his skills freely. When the school teacher fell ill, he helped organize families to take turns caring for her. Fort Worth came to respect Grant Russell as a man of integrity and capability. 2 months after Grant arrived, he rode into town and came back with a small velvet box. That evening, after supper was cleared and the children were occupied, He led Louisa out to the porch where the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I know we have not been courting long by traditional standards," he began, pulling the box from his pocket. "But I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Louisa Nash, you are my home, my heart, my partner in all things. Will you marry me?" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond, modest but beautiful. Louisa's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. "It is not much," Grant said quickly, misreading her reaction. "But I have been saving every penny from odd jobs in town, and I wanted you to have a real ring, something that shows you are cherished." "It is perfect," Louisa managed. "You are perfect. Yes, Grant, yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if made for her. They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, the future spreading out before them full of promise. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Fort Worth, with half the town in attendance. Louisa wore a dress she had carefully remade from her mother's wedding gown, and Grant wore a new suit purchased especially for the occasion. Thomas and William stood as groomsmen, bursting with pride, while Mary served as flower girl, taking her duties with utmost seriousness. Robert Nash walked his daughter down the aisle, his steps slow but steady, his face radiating joy. As he placed Louisa's hand in Grant's, he whispered, "Take care of my girl." "With my life, sir," Grant promised. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Grant kissed Louisa with such tender devotion that several women in the congregation sighed happily. The reception was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and music and well wishes. As evening fell and the guests departed, Grant carried Louisa over the threshold of the house they would now share as a married couple. Her father had moved into town to stay with his sister, giving the newlyweds privacy, though the children remained their responsibility and joy. That first night as husband and wife was gentle and passionate, Grant showing Louisa with his body what he had already proven with his actions, that she was treasured and loved. She gave herself to him without reservation, trusting him completely, and found joy she had never imagined in their union. The months that followed were not without challenges. The ranch still struggled financially, the work remained hard, and there were days when problems seemed to outnumber solutions. But facing everything together made all the difference. When a drought threatened the crops, Grant dug a new well with help from neighbors he had befriended. When cattle prices dropped, Louisa came up with the idea to sell her preserves and baked goods in town, which proved surprisingly profitable. They became known as a formidable team, the cowboy and his capable wife, and the ranch slowly began to thrive under their joint management. Grant proved to have a good head for business, negotiating better prices for their cattle and making connections with buyers in Dallas. Louisa's fierce determination and intimate knowledge of the land ensured they made the most of every resource. Thomas and William flourished under Grant's mentorship, growing into strong young men who took pride in the ranch. Mary adored her new brother-in-law, who spoiled her with affection while also teaching her to be tough when needed. The family that had been struggling and fragmented found new strength and unity. A year into their marriage, Louisa discovered she was pregnant. She told Grant one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage. "I am going to have a baby," she said simply, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. Grant's face transformed with wonder and joy. "Truly, truly. You are going to be a father." He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she were made of glass. "A father," he repeated in awe. "Louisa, you have made me the happiest man alive." "We are going to be busy," she warned with a laugh. "Another responsibility to add to the pile." Another blessing, Grant corrected. And we will share this one too, just like everything else. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Louisa chafed at Grant's insistence that she take things easier. He took over even more of the heavy work, enlisting Thomas and William's help, determined that his wife would not overtax herself. "I am pregnant, not fragile," Louisa protested when he tried to stop her from riding out to check the herd. "I know you are strong," Grant said, cupping her face gently. "But you do not have to prove it every minute. Let me take care of you for once. You have spent so many years taking care of everyone else. Let me give you this." Louisa softened, learning slowly to accept care instead of always giving it. It was a hard lesson for someone so used to self-reliance, but Grant was patient, showing her daily that accepting help was not weakness but partnership. When her time came in late spring of 1886, the birth was long and difficult. Grant paced outside the bedroom where the midwife and several neighbor women attended Louisa, his face drawn with worry. Each cry from his wife tore at him, making him feel helpless in a way he hated. Finally, after hours that felt like years, a new sound joined the fray, the lusty wail of a newborn. The midwife emerged, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Russell, a big healthy boy, and your wife is tired but well." Grant rushed into the room, finding Louisa pale and exhausted but radiant, cradling a red-faced bundle in her arms. She looked up at him with such love that his throat tightened with emotion. "Meet your son," she said softly. Grant approached carefully, almost afraid to touch something so small and precious. But when he took the baby in his arms and looked down at the tiny face, he was lost completely. This was his child, his son, a life he had helped create with the woman he loved. "He is perfect," Grant whispered. "Like his mother." They named him Robert Grant Russell, honoring Louisa's father and carrying forward Grant's name. Little Bobby, as they called him, became the light of the household. Thomas and William competed to hold him. Mary sang to him constantly, and Robert Nash Sr. traveled from town as often as his health allowed to dote on his grandson. Louisa adapted to motherhood with the same fierce competence she brought to everything, but this time she had Grant beside her for every feeding, every diaper change, every sleepless night. They shared the responsibilities as they had promised, Grant walking the floor with Bobby when he fussed so Louisa could rest, Louisa nursing their son while Grant handled the morning chores. The ranch continued to prosper. With the money from Louisa's, Preserve's business and Grant's shrewd cattle dealings, they were able to expand their herd and improve their property. They built a new barn, repaired the house, and even hired a hand to help with the work, a young man named Sam who reminded Grant of himself when he was younger and drifting. On Bobby's first birthday, they threw a celebration that brought together everyone who had supported them. Robert Nash, though frailer than ever, held his grandson and told stories about Louisa as a child, making everyone laugh. Neighbors who had once whispered about the arrangement between Louisa and Grant now spoke of them as an example of a strong marriage built on mutual respect and love. That night, after the guests had gone and Bobby was asleep in his cradle, Grant and Louisa sat on their porch as the stars emerged. "You remember when you rode up here almost 2 years ago?" Louisa asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "I thought you were just another drifter who would cause me more trouble. Do you remember when I first saw you, covered in dust and looking ready to shoot me if I gave you cause?" Grant replied with a smile. "I thought you were the most magnificent woman I had ever seen." Liar. "I looked terrible. You looked strong and capable and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fancy dresses or soft hands. You looked like home, though I did not realize it then." Louisa turned to kiss him softly. "They said I had too many responsibilities, that no man would want to take on a woman with all my burdens. And I said I would share them, Grant finished. Best decision I ever made. Life continued its rhythm on the ranch. 2 years later, Louisa gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, and 2 years after that, another son named Samuel. Each child was welcomed with joy, and each added to the busy chaos of the Russell household. Thomas grew to manhood and took over more of the ranch operations, eventually building his own small house on the property with a wife he had met in town. William went to school in Dallas to learn business, planning to return and help expand the ranch's operations. Mary grew into a lovely young woman who taught at the local school, staying close to her sister and the family she loved. Robert Nash passed peacefully in his sleep when Bobby was 5, having lived to see his daughter happy and his grandchildren thriving. The loss was painful, but Louisa took comfort in knowing her father had spent his last years without worry, secure in the knowledge that his family was cared for. The years brought changes to Fort Worth and the surrounding area. The railroad came through, bringing new opportunities and challenges. Grant and Louisa adapted, finding new markets for their cattle and expanding their operations thoughtfully. They weathered droughts and economic downturns, always together, always supporting each other. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Grant surprised Louisa with a trip to Dallas, arranging for Thomas and his wife to watch the children. It was the first time they had been alone together in years, and they savored the freedom like newlyweds. 10 years, Louisa marveled as they walked through the city streets, her hand tucked in Grant's arm. Sometimes it feels like yesterday you rode up to the ranch. Other times it feels like you have been with me always. I have been with you always, Grant said. I just had to find my way to you first. Every mile I traveled, every job I worked, it was all leading me to that day I heard about a ranch that needed help. They stayed in a nice hotel, dined in restaurants, and danced to music played by a real band. But the best moments were the quiet ones, lying together in the darkness, talking about their children, their dreams, their gratitude for the life they had built. When they returned to the ranch, Bobby ran to meet them, now a sturdy boy of 9 with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. Grace, at 7, had her mother's blonde hair and her father's gentle nature. Little Samuel, just 5, was all mischief and energy. I missed you, Bobby declared, hugging his mother fiercely. We were only gone 3 days, Louisa laughed, but she held him tight. 3 days is a long time, Bobby insisted. Grant ruffled his son's hair. He is right. Any time away from family is too long. As the children dragged them inside to tell them everything that had happened in their absence, Louisa caught Grant's eye and smiled. This was what they had built together, this loud, chaotic, loving family. These children, who would never know what it was to carry burdens alone, because they were being raised by parents who understood partnership in its truest form. The years continued their steady march. Bobby grew into a young man who loved the ranch as much as his parents did, already talking about running it someday. Grace discovered a talent for drawing and painting, capturing the beauty of the Texas prairie in her artwork. Samuel showed signs of his Uncle William's head for numbers and business. Louisa and Grant grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They still sat on the porch most evenings, still shared every responsibility, still looked at each other with the same devotion that had marked their early days. When Grant turned 50, Louisa threw him a surprise party that brought together 3 generations of family and friends. As he stood in the yard of the ranch they had built together, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, Grant felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Speech. Someone called out and the crowd took up the chant. Grant raised his hands for quiet, then pulled Louisa to his side. I am not much for speeches, he began, but I want to say this. 20 years ago, I was a drifter with nothing to my name but a horse and a saddle. I heard about a ranch that needed help, and I rode out here thinking I would work for a few weeks and move on like always. Instead, I found a woman who showed me what real strength looks like. I found a family that became my own. I found a purpose and a home. Louisa, you took a chance on a stranger and you gave me everything that matters. I love you more today than I did 20 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. There was not a dry eye in the crowd as Louisa kissed her husband, the sunset painting the sky behind them in shades of gold and crimson. Bobby, now 20, stood with his arm around a young woman he had been courting, looking at his parents with admiration. "That is what I want," he whispered to his sweetheart. "A love like theirs, built on partnership and respect." "Then you better be prepared to share all my responsibilities," she teased. "Every single one," Bobby promised, his father's son in every way that mattered. As the party continued into the evening, with music and dancing and laughter, Louisa took a moment to stand apart and survey the scene. The ranch that had nearly broken her with its demands now thrived, a testament to what two people could build together. The siblings she had raised were grown and happy, launched successfully into their own lives. The children she had born were healthy and strong, growing into fine people. Grant found her in the shadows, sliding his arms around her waist from behind. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything." "Nothing. How lucky I am." "We are both lucky. We found each other." Louisa turned in his embrace, looking up at the man who had kept every promise he ever made to her. "You know what the best part is? After all these years, all these children, all these responsibilities we have shared, I still get excited when I see you riding in from the pasture. My heart still skips when you smile at me." "Good," Grant murmured, kissing her softly. "Because mine does the same every time I see you." "That is never going to change, Louisa. Not ever." The years rolled on, bringing new challenges and new joys. Bobby married his sweetheart and brought her to live on the ranch, building a house near his parents. Grace married a kind man from Dallas but visited often with her growing family. Samuel went into business with his Uncle William, creating a successful cattle brokering operation that benefited the whole family. Louisa and Grant became grandparents many times over, their house always full of visiting grandchildren who loved hearing stories about the old days. Grant would tell them about riding up to the ranch for the first time, how their grandmother looked ready to shoot him off his horse. Louisa would tell them about the storm, how their grandfather had ridden out into danger to help save the cattle. "Why did you come to Grandma's ranch?" One grandchild asked Grant when he was in his 60s. "Because I heard she needed help and I needed a home. Turned out we needed each other." "Grandma says you saved her," the child said seriously. "No, sweetheart, we saved each other. That is what people who love each other do. They share the hard things so neither one has to carry them alone." It was a lesson their children and grandchildren took to heart, building their own partnerships based on the example they had witnessed. When Louisa and Grant celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary, the party was even bigger than Grant's 50th birthday had been. 4 generations gathered at the ranch, which Bobby now ran with his own son learning beside him. The original house had been expanded and improved, but the bones were the same, and the porch where Louisa and Grant had shared so many sunsets remained their favorite spot. They sat there as the party wound down, hands intertwined, watching their legacy move around them. Thomas and William, now in their 50s, sat with their wives and children. Mary, a spinster by choice who ran the school she had once attended, played piano for the grandchildren to dance. Bobby and his wife managed the crowd with practiced ease. Grace had come from Dallas with her whole family. Samuel and his wife of 15 years worked the crowd, making sure everyone had what they needed. "We did all right," Louisa said softly. "We did better than all right," Grant corrected. "We built something beautiful. We built it together. The only way worth building." As the stars emerged and the fireflies began their nightly dance, the great-grandchildren begged for a story. Grant and Louisa obliged, sitting in rocking chairs on the porch with the children gathered at their feet, just as Bobby and Grace and Samuel had once done. "Tell us about when Grandpa first came here," the oldest great-grandchild requested. So Louisa began the story, and Grant filled in details, and together they wove the tale of a struggling ranch and a drifting cowboy, of responsibilities shared and love found, of partnership that transformed two separate lives into one beautiful whole. When the story ended and the children were called to bed, when the guests had all departed and the house was quiet, Louisa and Grant remained on the porch. They were older now, their hair silver, their faces lined with years, but their hands still fit together perfectly and their hearts still beat in sync. "Do you ever regret it?" Louisa asked. "You could have kept drifting, could have gone anywhere, done anything. Instead, you stayed here and took on all my responsibilities." Grant turned to her, his eyes still clear and steady, still looking at her with the same love as that first night in the barn. "Louisa Russell, you are still worried about that after 40 years. I just want to make sure you are happy." "Happy?" Grant laughed softly. "Sweetheart, I have spent 40 years waking up next to the woman I love, working land that is ours, raising children and watching them raise their own children. I have shared your burdens and you have shared mine. I have never for 1 second been anything but grateful and joyful and completely, utterly happy. The only regret I have is that I did not find you sooner." Louisa leaned her head on his shoulder. "I love you, Grant Russell. I love you too, Louisa Russell, today, tomorrow, and always." They sat together as the night deepened. Two people who had found each other when each needed the other most, who had built a life on shared responsibilities and mutual respect, who had proven that the strongest partnerships are forged not in the absence of challenges, but in facing them together. The ranch that had once struggled under the weight of too many responsibilities for one person now thrived under the careful stewardship of multiple generations. The children who had once been Louisa's sole responsibility had grown into adults who carried on the legacy of partnership and love. The cowboy who had ridden up offering to share the load had kept his promise every single day for 40 years. As the moon rose over the Texas prairie, casting silver light across the land they had worked and loved and passed on to their children, Louisa and Grant Russell sat together in the peace that comes from a life well lived and a love well tended. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, with responsibilities that seemed too heavy for anyone to bear. But together they had not just carried those responsibilities, they had transformed them into blessings, into the foundation of a family, and a legacy that would endure for generations. The town of Fort Worth had grown around them over the decades, spreading out from its rough origins into something more civilized. But the Russell Ranch remained a constant, a testament to what could be built when two people truly partnered together, sharing not just the joys but the burdens, not just the triumphs but the struggles. Their story became legend in the area, told to young couples as an example of what marriage could be when built on the right foundation. The details might change in the telling, but the core remained the same. She had too many responsibilities. He said he would share them, and together they built something that would last forever. As they finally rose to go inside, Grant paused to look at the barn where he had spent his first night on the property, where he had kissed Louisa for the first time in the aftermath of a storm. So much had changed since then, but the feeling remained the same, the sense of home, of belonging, of being exactly where he was meant to be. "What are you thinking?" Louisa asked, following his gaze, just remembering, grateful for all of it, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts. "They are what made us strong." They walked into the house together, and the door closed behind them on a story that had begun with a desperate need and a generous offer, that had grown into a love that weathered all storms, and that would be remembered and treasured by all who came after. Because in the end, the greatest legacy they left was not the land or the cattle or the prosperity, though those were gifts to their descendants. The greatest legacy was the example they set, of two people who faced life as true partners, who shared every responsibility and every joy, who proved that the right person does not see your burdens as too heavy, but simply as part of the life you will build together. And on the Texas prairie, under the endless stars, the Russell Ranch stood as a monument to that truth, a place where responsibilities were shared, love was cultivated, and happiness was built one shared day at a time, from that first meeting until the very end of their days, and beyond in the hearts and lives of all who followed after.